The Iron Maiden. Probably one of the most recognizable medieval torture devices. A human-shaped cabinet with hinged doors that open to reveal menacing spikes, its victims placed inside with nowhere to go, the doors closing in on them, locking them away in darkness as spikes pierce their body. But Iron Maidens weren't medieval torture devices. They were completely made up. Now, of course, Iron Maidens exist. We see them in museums filled with supposed medieval torture devices, like this one I used to visit at the Medieval Times Dinner and Tournament in Lyndhurst, New Jersey. It was modeled after medieval Spain, so lots of good Spanish Inquisition things there.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition!
But Iron Maidens weren't medieval torture devices. The earliest known Iron Maiden was built in the early 19th century. That's the 1800s. But Iron Maidens are so iconic that they've become a cultural staple for all things dark, heavy, and metal. Like the band. One of the most iconic and influential heavy metal bands of all time. I just saw them a few months ago, actually, on their Future Past tour. Look how excited I am. They also pop up in video games, so many video games that I couldn't possibly list them all, but my brain goes straight to Skyrim with the Night Mother, who may not actually be an Iron Maiden, but she looks like she might have been locked away in one. Or sometimes you've got enemies and bosses that are named Iron Maiden, like the spiky enemies in Resi 4. Let me know in the comments where you've seen Iron Maidens in video games and pop culture. But in today's episode, we're going to explore the history of the Iron Maidens. If they weren't medieval torture devices, then where did they come from, and why have they become so iconic? Were they based on something else? And do they appear in the historical record? Being able to corroborate your sources is a really important part of doing history. So first, let's dive back into the historical record. Do we have any sources that mention anything like an Iron Maiden? Actually, yes. There are two sources that I know of. Our first source takes us back to the Punic Wars fought between Rome and Carthage, 264 to 146 BCE. A Roman statesman and general, Marcus Atilius Regulus, was defeated in battle and captured by the Carthaginians in northern Africa, just outside of Tunisia's modern-day capital, Tunis. Though he likely died of natural causes, the story of his death was very embellished. Why? Well, he served as a consul at one point. Rome in its Republic days had two consuls who served the leaders of Rome, kind of like a president, to overly simplify things. The consuls were there to balance out the power of the Senate. And as the story goes, he was impaled. Vlad, get out of here. It's not about you this time. Now, I've seen some versions claim that he was put in a box with spikes and rolled down a hill, and this 15th century manuscript shows him between the boards, looking a bit like an ice cream sandwich, to be honest. These were likely exaggerations to make him a legend, since he was, after all, a consul of Rome.
The Consul of Rome!
But it's also some evidence of some kind of impaling device. Okay, so let's take a look at the other source, Polybius, a Greek historian who lived between 200 and 118 BCE. Polybius wrote about something called the Iron Apega, a torture device made to look like the wife of a Spartan king named Nabis who ruled from 207 to 192 BCE. And if your only historical reference of Sparta is the film 300, for context, this is well after the Battle of Thermopylae and the Persian Wars, which were inaccurately depicted in that movie. But I'm not writing a history buff script, I'm doing half out, so I'll let that one go. The Iron Apega, according to Polybius, was a machine that looked like his wife, dressed in fancy clothes and all. Intended victims, like the Spartans who didn't pay their taxes, were told to give her a hug, and when they did, the machines would close spiked arms around them, and there were also spikes on the hands and on the chest, so the victim would be impaled front and back. And although this sounds awesome, historians believe it didn't actually exist, and Polybius was just using it as an allegory for the lengths Nabis would go to collect taxes. But both of these stories show us devices, mechanical or human operated, where the victim was impaled. So the idea of an impaling torture device was certainly around by the time the medieval period rolls by. But that's the thing. If there were Iron Maidens in the medieval period, we would have sources that reference them. Manuscripts would have little pictures of them doodled in the margins, right? Like the one we saw of Regulus being turned into a bloody ice cream sandwich. Or archaeologists would have found remnants of Iron Maidens. But the earliest known Iron Maiden we have belongs to the 19th century, the 1800s. Okay, so if the earliest physical Iron Maiden appeared in the early 1800s, where did the idea of it come from? Some historians believe it was philosopher and professor named Johann Philipp Siebenkees. Supposedly, in the late 18th century, that's the 1700s, Siebenkees wrote about how the Iron Maiden was used in 1515 to execute a man guilty of forging coins. But there's nothing to corroborate that claim. But other historians say that the oldest citation for an Iron Maiden in literature actually comes from Johann Georg Kessler, who mentioned it in his 1756 Travels Through Germany, Bohemia, Hungary, Switzerland, Italy, and Lorraine. I love old book titles. They just go long. They go for a long time, but they're very descriptive. But it was Siebenkees' mention of it that gained traction and served as the basis for building real Iron Maidens. The most famous is the Iron Maiden of Nuremberg. I mean, look at this thing. It's got all the hallmark characteristics. You've got the death mask of a woman on the front, you've got those heavy iron doors, you've got spikes on the inside. It's the classic image. The earliest appearance of this Iron Maiden of Nuremberg was likely in 1802. Now, unfortunately, the original artifact was destroyed during World War II. It was still on display in Nuremberg, but was destroyed by Allied bombing raids. But copies of it were made and sent around the world for various displays. One was bought by a J. Ickenhauser in London and sold to the Earl of Shrewsbury in 1890 to be put on display. Look at this awesome catalog advertising it. I found it in the Welcome collection. It advertises the Iron Maiden right on the front page, and here's what the source writes about the find. Quote, "The collection, so complete, may be to many somewhat gruesome, but it is of the highest educational value, as showing us the great strides which this century has made, not only in arts and sciences, but in interests of truth, humanity, and justice. No more does the Iron Maiden clasp her unhappy and unwilling victim in her deadly embrace." End quote. The source then goes on to mention my favorite torture device, which is the breaking wheel, along with other torture devices that were apparently no longer used in modern Britain, which at the time was the late 19th century. And this source tells us what we need to know about why the Iron Maiden was invented in the 1800s, as a way of showing people how far we've come. The Iron Maiden was created, in part, to highlight how barbaric the Middle Ages were with their torture devices and blood and violence, and isn't it great that we live in a time where that doesn't happen anymore? It was an attempt to paint the actually quite vibrant Middle Ages as the Dark Ages, where we apparently went backwards and were violent and bloodthirsty and barbarous, etc., etc., when in reality, the Middle Ages weren't like that. There is no Dark Ages. Sure, medical advancements were lacking, among other things, but to paint the entire period of time as the Dark Ages is doing it a great injustice. And I'm not just saying that because the Middle Ages and the medieval period is my jam. It's an injustice. The Nuremberg Iron Maiden was given a history of its own. Visitors were told that it was used during the Spanish Inquisition. I did a full-length podcast on that, where I talked about all the different torture devices used to extract confessions from accused non-believers. They were basic things like whips, metal rods, wooden planks, or cat-o'-nine-tails used to flog their backs. But then there was also the strappado, which, as you could see, suspended the victim in the air before dropping them and allowing those weights to break their bones and destroy their nerves. The rack was another classic, and the rack was real, and as I said in my episode on it, the torture rack stretched the prisoners out by their arms and legs, pulling them into like kind of a Vitruvian Man kind of situation, and from there, the torturer would crank a wheel that pulled their limbs back even more, snapping them out of their sockets, causing immense pain. And if they wanted to, the torturer could continue to crank the rack, ripping their arms and legs off completely. Joy. There was even an iron chair with rusty spikes on the seat, and sometimes a hole where they would put a fire underneath to burn the prisoner and give them some toasty bits. We know about all of these things, by the way, because there was so much record keeping during the Inquisition. So much record keeping. And we have a lot of corroborating evidence about these torture methods and devices because the church didn't see anything wrong with this. They literally allowed torture to happen to get confessions of heresy. Go watch my episode. It's pretty nasty. But there is nothing about an Iron Maiden in any of those multitudes of volumes of sources. But there was a real torture device which might have served as a basis for the very fictional Iron Maiden, the Shandmantel, or shame cloak. The Shandmantel, also called the Spanish coat, was a wooden bucket-looking thing sometimes lined with metal. The victim would wear this in public as a form of penance, and people would chuck rotten vegetables at them and insult them and whatnot. Kind of like a mobile version of stocks, and the point was to embarrass the person wearing it. And historians believe that the Iron Maiden might be a misinterpretation of the Shandmantel, a wooden device, sometimes metal, that surrounds the victim and encloses them in as a form of torture. There's no spikes, though. There's no spikes on the Shandmantel. So there you have it, an AF-out mini history on the Iron Maiden. Although billed as a medieval torture device, there's no real corroborated record of its existence beyond the ones made for museums. Instead, it's a relic of the 19th century, an attempt to impress people like us who love gross, gritty history. And though it was originally just a fake, its impact on society and culture is definitely real. Now, let me know in the comments or by giving me a like if you enjoyed this episode, because there are plenty of other medieval torture devices of dubious origins that I would love to explore. So if you want more, let me know. My name is Kelly Beard, and thank you for listening to this AF-out mini on Iron Maidens. If you enjoyed this episode, go check out some of my other minis or my longer podcast episodes, which drop every other Sunday. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any more bloody, gross, mysterious, or weird stories from history.